Some cite Weston A. Price worked to say eating seasonally, locally always leads to optimal health despite macronutrient intakes, and that carnivore isn't needed. What would you say, Harry? Now, Weston A. Price, when he actually went around in an era that was in the 1920s, 1930s. Back then, we didn't have refrigeration at all. So most things were basically not highly processed things, one. Second, they also had food traditions, where they deactivated the anti-nutrients. I'll give you an example. They would basically take flour, which also wasn't hybridized, had low gluten, and sometimes the Zia bread, for instance, had practically no gluten, and they would ferment it for 3 days, and they would make a bread out of that. And then they would use raw milk, which is high in lactoferrin, which would bind the lectins in the actual those carbohydrates and eliminate them. Plus, because the carbohydrates were expensive to produce, we didn't have modern day agriculture with tractors and cheap fertilizers and all that. The cost of these things was much more expensive, so you consumed less of it. Carbohydrates were about a quarter to a third of the intake. The rest was animal foods primarily all year round. So these people had a 2/3 animal food. If you take a look at the Blue Zone videos that I've actually made, I cover a lot of this sort of stuff. So these people were far more optimally eating compared to people today. The other thing is, a lot of these people were quite physically active. So that any amount of sugar they were mitigating through their physical activity. They were also under eating. Most cultures in the past underate for reasons, economic reasons, and also for cultural reasons. So there was all that. Like in Japan, they only eat up to 80% full. The only people that get fat, that have the Denisovans, Neanderthal genes as well, but you don't see them very fat, are pretty much that's one thing that I missed. I should have actually, somebody asked me a question about the Japanese, and I sort of said, oh, well, they've probably got some adaptations. But I thought about it again after, and I go, no, you're fucking idiot. What'd you say that? I shouldn't have said that at all. Oh, that was just an error on my part, or a lazy error, to be honest. So stupid. So really my sort of thinking now is, well, take samurais, they eat an excess amount of rice and stuff like that. They get bloody fat. They get really fat, morbidly obese, but they're very physically active and move around quite a bit and sort of stay within a certain threshold of insulin sensitivity until they leave the sport, and then they do suffer health problems. But up until that point, so they can get just as fat. They do have those genetics. Most Northeast Asians, but they have a culture of under eating up to 80%. It's a tradition culture, and so they don't eat in excess. But when it comes to the people that do sumo wrestling, they overeat deliberately to fatten up. So that's one thing that I wanted to touch that I didn't actually touch. But pretty much Weston A. Price was looking at a population of very different era. Also, if in the Swiss Alps, they were actually using potash, ash from their fireplaces, which was putting minerals back into the soil, and they were plowing that soil. They were also recovering. They actually would put up barriers to recover mineral loss, so they could actually, if it came through, with the glacial sort of stuff, waters as they melt, and they would take some of that. They would go down and dig it all up from that lower riverbed, and they would bring it back up to that top part where they actually planted things. So they maintained a certain level of fertility to the soil. So the foods then had, double or quadruple in some cases of what the nutrient density micronutrients. So even though they were eating less, they were basically ending up getting good nutrient density. plus all the animal foods that they were consuming as well, because back then, no refrigeration. The majority was salted animal food or freshly slaughtered. So it was 2/3 animal food, 1/3 plants. So is it as optimal as a carnivore diet? No, it's not. But is it doable? Yes, it is. But you've got to basically be physically active like those people were quite a bit, and under eat to some extent to be able to make it work. So is that practical for most people? No. I just basically rather just eat steaks and eggs and stuff like that, and some dairy and whatever, and and not bother with having to ferment foods. My father still does some lentils and stuff like that because he loves them, and I have to say I do like lentils as well. I grew up on them, but he has to soak them for a whole week. It's just excessive amounts of labor that you have to do in order to bring down the anti-nutrients to make it less problematic. So waste of time in the modern era. But back then, when you had limited food resources, it was justified based on, as we just need to get as much as we can.